Okay, so today we're going to look at the life of Anne Bradstreet. We're going to start by doing a biography, and then in the next lecture, we're going to look at her main work and also her main influence. Anne Bradstreet was born in 1612. She was well tutored in history, literature, and several languages because of the stature of her family and the influence and wealth of her father. In 1628, as a teen, she suffers a severe case of smallpox. This case of smallpox, as you well know, left some marks upon her skin and scarring, and so she had understood that she was very comely and beautiful prior to having the smallpox, and so this humbled her disposition about her own appearance a little bit and took away some of maybe the arrogance that she had about herself. She marries Simon Bradstreet, who was an employee or an assistant to her father, and she grew to have a romantic attraction to him. Her first son, Samuel, was born in 1633 after they migrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and helped settle Boston. Sa- Samuel, it took them a number of years to conceive, and so she was a little bit concerned about her capability of conception, and so it was a great relief to her to have her son Samuel. Her father, Thomas Dudley, becomes governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1634. In the last lecture, I did talk about how the Dudleys and the Bradstreets, so her parents, and Simon and Anne were among the first migrants to Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were on the ship, the Arbella, which was the flagship of Winthrop's flotilla, and so she was present on the ship when John Winthrop preached the sermon, The Model of Christian Charity, as they are approaching harbor in Boston. So her father, Thomas Dudley, becomes governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so an extremely influential family during this time of his leadership of Massachusetts Bay Colony. There were a number of theological and, in turn, political controversies that took place with the community. First of which is in 1635, you have the exile of Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a dissenter that was causing dissent to the monarchy. And though the dissenting peoples of the Puritans were dissenters in a theological and an ecclesiological sense, they were not dissenters in a patriotic or in a monarchical sense, and they wished to see the Reformation as Puritans of the church. They didn't wish to break free from it at this time. And so Roger Williams wanted to make a clean break from the church and from the state. And so he was exiled and he settled the colony of Rhode Island. Shortly following this, you have the antinomian controversy, of which Anne Hutchinson is under trial from 1637 to 1638. Hutchinson was an extremely influential woman who was leading Bible studies in her home of women and speaking prophetic utterances and undermining the authority of Thomas Hooker and John Cotton, who were the ministerial leaders of Massachusetts Bay Colony at this time. And so she was declared an antinomian, somebody who was contrary to the law, and she was exiled. She, in turn, had also flipped the same charge and accused Thomas Hooker as being an antinomian himself. And so this was a slur that was used for somebody who was outside the realm of orthodoxy at the time. It's no surprise that because of these controversies, it was imperative for Massachusetts Bay Colony to establish the first collegiate center of education in the British colonial Americas. So in 1636, in the throes of everything that's happening, Harvard University was founded in order to train up godly ministers that would be filterers and protectors of doctrine for the people, and would help keep the order, the law and order of society from a biblical and scriptural standpoint, and help keep the people in covenant and in contract with God. In 1641, Anne Bradstreet composes her elegy to Du Bartas, which we'll talk more about Du Bartas as her major influence in the next lecture. And then in 1642, the British-English Civil War begins, and so that is what stimulates her drafting or her composition of a dialogue between Old England and New, because England is on the verge of having the opportunity to create a whole new a status for itself, and it actually does achieve that by the end of the 1640s. Parliament and the Puritans gain control of the government. In 1649, they put King Charles the First, the monarch, under trial and lawfully try him and execute him. And so there is the regicide of King Charles the First, which is a term that describes the lawful execution of a king. And the Puritans gain control of all of Parliament. They cleanse or purify Parliament. And during the 1650s, there is this interregnum period where you have the Puritan experiment of government. Lord Oliver Cromwell becomes the Lord Protectorate of all of England, and he carries out the rule of Parliament from a judicial standpoint. At the end of the 1650s, the experiment fails, and the Parliament is given over back to the Royalists, who then invite Charles II, the deceased King Charles I's son, who had fled England to the courts of France and had sought refuge in the Catholic King of France's court. And so during this time, King Charles II was profoundly shaped and influenced by Roman Catholicism, and he returns to England as somewhat of a crypto-Catholic. He reinstitutes Anglicanism and the Book of Common Prayer, and he creates the Act of Uniformity in 1662, and ultimately he ejects about 2,000 pastors who have land and who have title and who have congregations, and they lose their livelihood and have to flee as refuges, preaching in the wilderness of England and having secret conventicles. Which this was the 1660s was an era of a lot of very significant Puritan writings because of this persecution that took place of the Puritans. So, in 1645, her family and the Dudleys moved to Andover. During this time, she composes the Quaternions, and then she also composes the Four Monarchies, which those two compositions make up a major section of her 10th Muse, Lately Sprang Up in America, which is published in 1650. The Quaternions is four subunits of a poem that are also made up of fours. There are the four elements: water, earth, wind, and fire. And those make up the natural composition of all of the world. And then there are the four humors, and those four humors produce those glands produce the biles in which natural scientists and herbologists would study the bile to understand the health of a human being. And so they the four humors governed the health of a human being. And then the third of the Quaternion was the four ages of history that were covered, followed by the four seasons. And so all of history of the cosmos, of the four elements, are temporally governed by these ages, and the human cycle of the year, and life is governed by these four seasons. So you see these four fours interlocked and intermingling based on materiality and also temporality. This is followed by the four monarchies, and the four monarchies cover the Persians, the Assyrians, the Grecians, and the Romans. And there is some sort of connection to the Daniel image of the statue of these four empires throughout time. In 1661, her husband Simon, because of the fact that the monarchy was restored in 1660, he is responsible and is sent by Massachusetts Bay Colony to renegotiate the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so he has to meet with Charles II and his advisors to make sure that the entire dominion of New England is ready and orderly and in proper submission and loyalty to the king. This time of separation is a difficult time for her, and so we'll even get to talk about that briefly in a minute. In 1666, her Andover home is burned down, and when her Andover home is burned down, she loses her library, and even a lot of her unpublished writings and manuscripts were lost in the fire. And so there is volumes of material that perhaps uh, could have been saved or rescued that we will never know about. It's a kind of a helpful understanding that it's not history unless we have it. It's not a memory unless it's rescued or preserved in some sort of way. During this last half of the 60s, she also experiences other trials and afflictions that are devastating to her. Her daughter, Elizabeth, her daughter in law, Elizabeth, has four children over the course of the late 1660s and early 1670s, and all four of those children die in the early years of life. Elizabeth dies at the age of 3. Anne dies as a toddler, not quite 2, I believe. And this is her namesake child. She also, Mercy, her daughter-in-law, has a son, and then a fourth child, another daughter that is named after her as well, given a namesake name of Anne. And that fourth child, when she dies, it's just days after the birth, and likewise, Mercy also expires and passes away as well. And so she composes and pens a number of poems to these children that lament their lives, and their very brief lives at that. Two poems to look at briefly are on 240 and 243. They talk about the fit of sickness that she has. She went through bouts of sickness throughout her life, and times where she had to go into convalescence where for weeks or even a month at a time. During particular seasons, she would be bedridden, and she felt very guilty about this because she was a hardworking mother and a loving wife, and maybe part of the stress of that hard work is what led to these periods and bouts of sickness. So in this poem, upon a fit of sickness, she writes, "All men must die, and so must I. This cannot be revoked." Down on line 13, she says, "For what's this life but care and strife, since first we came from womb?" And then in 29 through 32, "The race is run, the field is won. The victory is mine, I see. Forever known, thou envious foe, the foil belongs to thee." So she had a real clear sense of mortality, of the fleetingness of life, how every life is but mown grass. It's there one day, but then it's mown the next. And so her sickliness and her faint disposition was a clear reminder of that. Now, of course, during these fits of sickness was also times in which she was able to produce and compose much of her writing. So it was a period that was of benefit or profit to her as well. And then also, uh, this sense of mortality comes out in Before the Birth of One of Her Children, where she says, "These farewell lines to recommend to thee, that when the knots untied that made us one, I may seem thine, who in effect am none." She's talking about if she dies in the birthing process and the knot of her marriage is untied, it's undone. She needs to understand and accept that. And then later it says that she wants her husband to protect her children from stepdame's injury. And so